Hi guys! We're nearing the end of my YouTube series on Big Questions Debate. So if you haven't already, you should really go ahead and check out the other videos on what Big Questions Debate is, with a detailed approach on all the steps throughout the debate, how to structure arguments, rebuttals, your speeches, managing prep time, all of that good stuff. So if you don't have that foundation, today's lesson might be a little bit confusing as we're going to reference some of those speeches and things that we learned throughout. Today's lesson is mainly going to be on ethics and just some common mistakes and misconceptions, such as judge adaptation and stuff like that. So really make sure you go and check out the previous videos before this one. That being said, let's get into today's lesson. First, let's start out with ethics. So rule number 1, you don't want to read progressive arguments or off-case arguments using progressive framing, any of that. What does this mean? This means when you do your framework, which we talked about in previous lessons, you don't want to have some sort of abusive framework that makes it super hard for your opponent to prove. Even though that might be an easy win for you, a lot of judges and opponents don't like that. They see it as abusive and not fair and not maintaining the essence of the debate. So that would usually only works against you, not for you. Rule number 2, realize you're talking about real issues and real people. This one year I had this girl, she was talking about the Holocaust. She made a really insensitive comment in her case, and it did not end well for her. So again, be respectful, recognize that a lot of these ideas that you're going to be debating impact real people, and so just be mindful of that. 3, do not lie or misconstrue evidence. It will always come back to bite you. We kind of briefly mentioned this in my second video about cutting cards. So again, if there's a card that says religious beliefs and practices do not lead to wars, and you cut out the word not and you say religious beliefs and practices do lead to wars, that's completely misconstruing what the card was set out to say, and that's pretty much lying. You can't just cut out words that completely misconstrue the evidence. So don't do that. Rule number 4, if you guys are competing as a team, if you have a partner, if you guys are collaborating, don't steal their prep. It's not very nice. Obviously, it's okay to ask someone, hey, I really like that piece of evidence. Can you tell me what source you got it from? That's obviously okay. And again, it's up to that person if they want to give you their source or not. But do whatever you can to avoid plagiarizing and copying someone else's work. It's not fair to them, it's not fair to your opponent, it's not fair to your judge who's spending their time watching your debate. So just don't do it. Alright, rule number 5, no debater math. So some people have an issue, a lot of kids have an issue with this. So debater math is, let me give you an example of what debater math entails. So this one year, again, the year about religious beliefs and practices, I was talking about wars and how they are primarily self-interested. My opponent comes back with some debater math. They have one source that says most people who enlist to be in the military do it to protect their nation. Another source said that most people who enlist in the military do it for their family, like 20% do it for their family. A third source said 10% do it for national reasons, like feelings of nationality, whatever. And so they said, so in total, 60% of people enlist to join the military for selfless reasons. So they're not self-interested at all. That's not okay. You can't add a bunch of stats from a bunch of sources and present that. Also, if someone gives you a percentage, you can't convert that into a whole number. Strictly use numbers that are provided to you. Do not do debater math. Big no-no. If an experienced judge catches you doing that, that's not going to end well for you. 6, do not argue or talk back to your judge. Sometimes I understand it's frustrating. You feel like you did amazing. You think it's an easy win for you, and your judge doesn't vote for you, and they're giving feedback, and you're thinking, oh my god, what are they saying? That's completely inaccurate. I didn't do that. Or I did do that. They're saying I didn't talk about this point, but I did. What are they doing? Blah, blah, blah. Do not argue with your judge. I've had opponents who have talked back to my judge. Judge put them in their place and said automatic loss. Some judges are cutthroat like that. Don't do it. At the end of the day, I tell my students that even if the judge seems to be unfair, it still falls partially on you, because their misconception just means that you didn't make it clear enough, right? So think about how you can improve. Don't try and blame other people as well. It's just a general human thing to do. 7, it's okay to be respectful and ask for feedback, but please don't ask the judge to disclose. Asking a judge to disclose means asking the judge to tell you who won or lost that round. A lot of judges and opponents might see this as rude or unprofessional, mainly because a lot of tournaments don't want you to disclose as it is. It can also lead to discouragement for you and or your opponent, depending on who won or lost. You don't want the judge to see that as something negative and use that against you. It's okay to ask for feedback, so I usually phrase it like, whenever it seems like they're done writing or submitting their ballot, I ask, hey judge, before we leave, do you have any general feedback you can provide for us for future rounds, or as we progress through this tournament, or as we continue through these rounds, however you want to word it. If the judge, again, feel out the judge. If the judge doesn't seem like they're having it, maybe it's better to just let it go. 8, be nice to your judge, courteous, but do not suck up. Does not look good. Your judge is not stupid. They're gonna know if you're trying to suck up to them. I've judged so many tournaments now that I'm in college, and so many people know me in the circuit and come up to me before or after the round and say, oh wow, I've heard so much about you. You're such an inspiration. Try to nosy their way into my life. Oh, what are you studying now? Oh my gosh, that's so cool. Congratulations. Thank you, but it seems fake, and a judge will tell if it's fake. Not to mention your opponent might get annoyed. I get annoyed. I used to get annoyed when my opponents did that to a judge. I usually don't shake judges' hands either. I only will shake a judge's hand if my opponent goes and shakes their hand first. Other than that, I also see that kind of as trying to suck up. I wouldn't do that. The most I do is say thank you for judging at the end as I exit the room. Other than that, I would say keep it short and sweet with the judge. Alright. 8. So before your round starts, I recommend that you introduce yourself to your opponent, especially if you're waiting out in the hall and your judge hasn't arrived to the room yet. I always say, hey, how are you? Are you blah, 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 because it'll have your opponent. They'll be like, oh, yeah. Be like, oh, nice to meet you. I'm blah, blah, blah. Shake hands. A lot of my closest friends have come from debate, even from other schools. So really form those connections. You never know how it'll help you either in the debate circuit or long-term in life. It's always good to network and form connections. 9, if your opponent is being mean, just be more kind. Maintain your decorum. Oh, sorry. Ignore these names. These names are specifically from my elementary school students. But maintain your decorum. Remember, whoever you're competing for, you represent them at the end of the day. So even if you want to be mean, remember it's not just about you. You're also standing for something bigger than yourself. So if you don't care about ruining your own name, at least care about who you're there for. Not to mention, a judge does notice. Again, your judge is not dumb. They're going to know if your opponent is being overly rude, and it'll only hurt them, and it'll only benefit you if you're being nice. I've had one of my students, her name was Dorothy. She was super nice to a really, really rude opponent, and the judge voted for her just because of that, and they even wrote it in the ballot. They said, you did well, but the opponent was just so rude and made it so hard to even want to listen to them, right? Rule 10, do not talk about your opponents after a debate unless you are reviewing the debate. Don't be disrespectful and talk bad about them. Be the bigger person, even if you win or lose. My high school used to call it bus talk. If you wanted to trash talk, save it for the bus ride. You never know who's listening. The walls have ears. Again, you're representing your school, your teammates, your legacy. You don't want to be known as someone who is always trash talking the competition. Judge adaptation. In debate circuit, especially with big questions debate, a lot of your judges are going to be parent judges because in order to enroll for a debate, you have to supply typically a judge. So unless you pay for an experienced high school judge to do it for you and be your assigned judge to complete your specific amount of hours, a lot of these people are going to be parents that have never heard of the topic before, don't have the background knowledge that you do. A lot of them might have a language barrier, so they might want you to speak slower than some judge who's experienced. Always be prepared for that. Remember, even though I know what you mean, you might know what you mean, your opponent might know what you mean, doesn't mean the judge always does. Another thing you want to do is maintain eye contact. Some judges don't care, some judges it's important for. There's this thing called a paradigm when you get notified with your round that you're supposed to attend and the judge that's going to be assigned to you. There's usually this document looking icon next to their name. If you click on that, usually they'll have typed out a paradigm, which is their preferences, their experience, kind of outlines that for you so you can mentally prepare before you walk into the round. In my cases, I always have some italicized parts, which are stuff that aren't too necessary, but are stuff that I take out when I have a parent judge that asks me to talk slow. So if I have a parent judge and in their paradigm it says, please talk a little bit slower, it's hard for me to understand. I know, alright, I'm going to talk at a slower rate than I did my last round where I had a college student judge me that's done debate before. So I'm going to take out these italicized parts. I already have pre-prepared how to plan accordingly. So that's always some tweaks you should make. Also, even if your judge doesn't want you to make eye contact, it's important to still be looking at the judge throughout your round. A lot of judges, you can read their faces super easily or their body language. If your judge is nodding along, you know that they're understanding and they're kind of agreeing with what you're saying, and that's a good indication that that's a really good point. You should probably bring that point up again towards the end, and that you can kind of move on to your next point because the judge is following. If the judge stops nodding or looks confused, that shows maybe they're misunderstanding what you're saying. You need to explain it differently, you need to provide an example, or you need to talk about it a little bit more in your next speech. You want to be looking at them while your opponent is speaking. A lot of students make this mistake when their opponent is speaking. They're just so focused on preparing for the next speech and taking notes that they're not looking at their judge. Something you should do is look at your judge when your opponent is speaking so you can see, oh, they're nodding along to this part, so I want to make sure I provide a really good argument against this part. Oh, they look super confused about this part, so I'm going to harp on that. In my next speech, I'm going to say, my opponent said this and this and that, but judge, that completely makes zero sense. It's illogical to think blah, 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 blah. It's actually blah, 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 blah that causes it because X, Y, and Z. This is a really, really good skill to have because it kind of allows you to have an easy win, so to say, because you're pretty much doing everything ideal in your judge's world. This is an amazing, amazing skill to develop. If your judge wants you to talk slow, usually it means that they're not experienced and they don't know what dropping arguments is. To recap, dropping arguments means you didn't bring up an argument in your last couple of speeches, so you're not allowed to bring it up as a point in your final speech. However, if the judge wants you to talk slow and they seem like a parent judge, they probably don't know this rule. So sometimes it's okay to not necessarily cheat, but not follow the strict rules per se. So if the judge wants you to talk slower, sometimes it's good to talk slower, explain, miss a point or two that you wanted to bring up but just didn't have time to, talking at that sort of speed, and then bring it up in a later speech. Again, this all depends on the round, the type of judge you have, so be able to be adaptable based on the situation. This takes a lot of practice, don't worry. My first year I did public forum debate, I went 0-4 every single tournament, meaning I lost all of my rounds. I mean, I celebrated when I went 1-3, and when I went 2-2, like, forget it, that was like the best day of my life. And now I'm a state, and national champ or top 10 national champions. So again, don't worry. Practice makes perfect. If their feedback is dumb, I don't like using the word dumb because feedback is feedback at the end of the day. Everyone has their own opinions. But if a parent says something that you're like, that you immediately know is actually wrong, it's okay. Just say thank you. I pretend to write stuff down when the judge is giving feedback, so it seems like I'm engaged even if I don't agree with what they're saying and I know that what they're saying is wrong. Still do that to show respect and be the bigger person, be nice, be respectful. Do not talk back to your judge again. Lingo. So some parent judges don't understand the type of lingo you're using, so you want to clarify. So if you're in the questioning segment and you ask your opponent, do you have a card for that? Your judge might say, a card? Like what? What's a card? Instead, you can say, do you have a piece of evidence for that? Do you have an evidence card for that? Do you have a card or evidence for that? So to kind of indicate what a card is, or just not use the word card at all. When you're saying flow through, a lot of judges don't know what flow through means. So I like to say, judge, my opponent, and also drop. So an experienced person would say, judge, my opponent dropped this argument in their last two speeches, so do not allow them to bring it up in the next speech, and do not flow through this point. A parent judge might have no clue what that means, so you should rephrase, judge, my opponent never brought up this point in his last two speeches, and so according to the debate rules, he is not allowed to bring it up in his next speech, so if he does, do not write it down on your paper and use it in determining who wins this round. That would be a better way to phrase it for a parent judge. Again, be able to be adaptable. Explain why. This is one of my biggest tips ever, and I try and stress this with my students, and sometimes it's so stressful because they don't listen. But please, whoever's out there, please listen to this point. Again, even though I know what you mean, even though you know what you mean, coach knows what you mean, your opponent knows what you mean, that doesn't mean your judge does. So, if I say, dopamine is just an effect, not a motivator, a judge might think, what? Right? So, you say dopamine is released in your body after you do something enjoyable. This shows that dopamine is an effect, not a motivator. Example, according to Harvard Health EDU, dopamine can provide an intense feeling of reward. Dopamine is most notably involved in helping us feel pleasure as part of the brain's reward system. This means that dopamine is an effect of the action and therefore can't be a motivator. My opponent is merely stating a fact that people experience happiness after doing a good deed, but fails to link it to exactly what drives the person to do that good deed. Makes sense? So, obviously, make sure you explain. The thing I always love to do, and I actually just texted my student about this because I watched her debate, so I'll use her as the perfect example. So, they were debating this year's resolution, creativity is a more powerful force than intelligence. She was on the AF, so she was saying, yes, creativity is. Her opponent was on the neg. He said, no, creativity is not the more powerful force. So, he kept saying, intelligence allows us to remember things. And if we don't remember the creative idea, then we can't implement the creative idea. However, both of their frameworks were talking about we should focus on which of the forces creates the most change. So I told her, ask yourself why. Ask yourself what exactly your opponent is saying. And I told her you should always try and do two rebuttals. So you first say, judge. First of all, remembering is not an intelligent process because intelligence is defined as only applying and acquiring knowledge or what we remember. And remembering is just a natural process. It has nothing to do with applying and acquiring knowledge. Then you say, however, judge, if you still agree with my opponent that remembering is an intelligent process, remembering is actually completely non-unique to this resolution. We both agree that the framework should be inciting change, and remembering something has nothing to do with change. It's what we do with that knowledge and what we remember that incites the change. And I've proven in my case, as well as through the definition of creativity, which is creating new things, that is what leads to change. Not exactly the knowledge, but what we do with the knowledge. And what we do is creative, and that's what incites change, right? So you always have to ask yourself, why? So you could say, my opponent never explains why remembering something actually leads to change, because it doesn't, right? So always ask yourself why. That's always such a great rebuttal. Judges love that. I love that. So use that. Again, do not do debate or math. Big no-no. Nerves. Again, most judges are parent judges. One judge once fell asleep in the middle of my round. Or, not necessarily fell asleep, but they were sitting there like this. Eyes closed. It was obvious that they were tired, no judgment. They were probably having a long day. A lot of judges also are going to have a hard time keeping up with what you're saying. So if you are the most confident person in the room, even if you're thinking to yourself, what am I saying? It's okay, because as long as you look super confident, you feel super confident, you act super confident, if your opponent is hesitating, pausing, confused, even if what they're saying is technically better than what you're saying, a lot of times you might just win. And that sucks sometimes, because it's better to have a judge that can zone that out. But debate is also about the way you present the argument. And so fake it till you make it. Speak loud and clearly. Focus on emphasizing certain words. I like to bold phrases and words through my case that I want to emphasize. And then the more I practice, I naturally emphasize those words when I look at it. Don't use it's better to take a pause. So that means you should pause. Sorry, that was a bad example, but you get what I'm saying. Eye contact. So a lot of parents, that's like their biggest feedback on the ballot. They'll say, you didn't give me enough eye contact. It made it hard to listen. That might be frustrating again, but just do it. Use your time. Please, 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 please use your time. So a lot of kids, especially the AF rebuttal, because you don't know what the neg is going to say yet. So all you really can do is rebut their case. You don't really have anything to defend because you haven't heard their attacks yet. If you get through 3 minutes and you rebutted all their points perfectly, there's nothing left for you to say against their case, really. Move on to your case. Then you go, Judge, now let's move on to my case and weigh. Start weighing from the beginning. Who cares? My first contention talks about blah, blah, blah. This is important because blah, blah, blah. When compared to my opponent's case, this is way more important than that. On my contention too, blah, blah. There's still stuff you can do. Don't stop your speech if you have nothing else left to say. Just find something else to say. Do not concede. So, you never want to agree with your opponent's point. You only can agree if you're turning it. So if my opponent is talking about social media, they're saying social media is creative because people are creating ads and campaigns and it leads to this impact, this impact, this impact. You can say, yeah, Judge, I agree. Social media does lead to these impacts. However, social media is not based by creativity. Just because someone created an ad doesn't mean that creativity was used. Creativity involves original and new ideas. A lot of these ads are not new or original ideas. People see ads out there and they digest that information. They see what worked for other people and they mimic that. That's called applying and acquiring knowledge. Not to mention, the social media that we're using comes from people who use their intelligence in order to create these platforms, right? A baby cannot create social media because they don't have the basic intelligence and foundation necessary to do so. Most of social media, as well as the ads and campaigns that come from it, come from intelligent processes. So yes, social media does lead to these impacts, but it has nothing or very little to do with creativity, right? That would be a really good point. So don't concede by saying, if your opponent asks, isn't it true, blah, 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 never just say, yeah, I guess. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Like, no. The debate I watched today, the AF was arguing about trial and error. And they were saying trial and error is creative because something fails, you think of something else. If it fails again, you think of something else. Once something works, okay, yeah, it worked. Now it can become established knowledge. But it was creativity of asking, what if I try this? What if I do that? That led to that knowledge being found or created, right? So then the opponent was talking about NASA and as one of his examples of some other point. And Raven, the girl, she asks, well, doesn't NASA use trial and error? And the guy said, no, they applied and acquired knowledge. And so then she came back and said, science is all about trial and error. Like, what? And so it's what he should have done and says, yeah, in certain situations, NASA uses trial and error, but this trial and error has to come from some sort of intelligent foundation. What is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is an educated guess. Everything that they tried was based on some sort of knowledge. That's why they tried it. So it actually came from intelligence, right? Sometimes it's better to concede and turn the argument onto your side than to just completely negate everything your opponent is saying, because that might make you look less credible. Like, to me, when he said NASA doesn't use trial and error, like, it's common knowledge that science is a lot about trial and error, right? So be very careful with concessions. Starting off, I say don't concede, because a lot of kiddos don't know how to turn arguments. But once you are able to do that, you can concede only if you're turning it. But then also be careful that your turn is super, super good, because if it's not, then your opponent can just say, they conceded to these impacts, however, their turn was weak. It's actually this and this and that. So be very careful. Cards should always have the year. So, again, according to BBC 21, 21 means 2021. Shouldn't be using 1921. If you use, according to BBC 89, that's assumed it's 1989 because we haven't hit 2089, right? It's not going to be assumed that you're using a card from 1889. I always recommend use cards from the last couple of years, 2020 and beyond. Only use earlier cards if necessary, because a lot of times your opponent will say, well, my card says the exact opposite and it's from 10 years after your card came about. So since then, new evidence has been come up and my card is more accurate. So the earlier, the better, obviously. Look at the judge, not the opponents. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see, specifically in questioning. So in questioning, most students just look at their opponent and say, well, what about blah, blah, blah? Well, don't you agree, blah, 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 blah. No. Only look at your judge. You should not even look at your opponent, not even once throughout the entire debate round, only at the end when you shake their hand. So don't just attack written definitions. Say why we should agree with yours. So, I saw this problem today with creativity. The AF was saying, we should use my definition of creativity, that it's the creation of something new. And the other person the neg was saying, we should use my definition of creativity, that it's imagination or an original idea. Obviously, the neg wants to use that because they will say an idea is just an idea. It's intelligence that implements it. And the AF wants you to use their definition because, well, creativity is the actual creation of something. And so that is what's showing the impact. It's not just an idea. Neither one of them told me why. They were just saying, well, this one helps my case. We should focus on this because it's just creating an idea. We should focus on this because it's actually creating something tangible. Well, yeah, obviously you want me to use that because it helps you, but why is that the better definition? Why should I vote for that definition over your opponent's? You have to tell your judge why. I always love doing this with an example. So let me give you a good example based on the self-interest debate. So the resolution was, humans are primarily self-interested. One definition was self-interest. It had something to do with acting solely for yourself and not working with others at all, like just yourself. I wanted the definition when I was on AF that it is particularly for yourself, because that shows that sometimes you could be helping others and still be self-interested, right? And that really helped my case, because I talked about parochialism, and one of the examples I used in parochialism was hunters and gatherers, that they were hungry, they needed food, they knew they couldn't kill the woolly mammoth on their own, so they hunted and gathered in groups because they couldn't do what they wanted to alone. And so we were going back and forth, whose definition should we use and why? So I said, Judge, you should use my definition because it makes complete sense. For example, let's say I'm in a group project. I want to get a good grade. So I'm going to do what the project says to do, which is work with my partner in order to get that good grade. So my goal is completely to get the good grade for myself. Honestly, I don't really care what grade my partner has at the end of the year, but I know for that specific project, I want to get a good grade, so yeah, I'm going to work with the other person. Just because you're working with people doesn't mean that you're not acting mainly for yourself, right? Your motive is still in your interest, not the others, even though you're working with him. You're working with him for your own motive, right? So using an example is probably my best advice for how to explain why your burden or definitions or framework makes the most sense. And all of my ballots, especially my senior year in high school, because I was great at providing examples like that on the fly, every single one of my ballots said, I loved your use of examples. It really made it easy for me to vote for you because your case made sense. At the end of the day, a lot of these debates are going to be a wash almost. One person is saying one thing, their card says this. Another person is saying the other thing, their card says the opposite. A lot of stuff with big questions debate are going to have two cards saying the exact opposite, because big questions debate is so philosophical and ideological based. People have different ideas. Obviously, there's going to be cards talking about both sides. So if you're able to come up with examples like that on the fly that make sense, it just puts your card that much more forward and makes it that much more likely for the judge to vote for you. So another issue I notice is that a lot of my kiddos' opponents don't provide evidence or a card for certain points, and so my kiddos will say, my opponent didn't provide a card, so drop their argument. Moving on. And I provided a card, so flow mine through. It's always good to make note of that, to tell your judge, hey judge, my opponent didn't provide a card for this, so we should prefer my evidence over their idea. However, their idea still doesn't make sense. You still want to rebut the idea, because if all you do, I remember one of my kids, that's all he did, because one person he debated had zero evidence. So my kiddo said, their contention 1, subpoint A, they talked about this, but they didn't have a card, so you should drop that point. Their subpoint B, they talked about this, but they didn't have a card, so you should drop that point. And by the end of the speech, he didn't actually rebut any of the arguments. He just said they don't have evidence, so drop it. And it's hard to drop it when they can still logically make the argument on why their argument and idea makes sense. Especially with big questions when it's so ideologically based and not like public forum where you have to talk about politics and it's just mainly ideas. You to just refute evidence by saying you don't have a card for it. It's always important to make note of that, so even if your judge agrees with their point slightly, if they're like on the edge about it, then they could say, well, they didn't have a card for it, whereas this person did, so I'll lean towards this person. It's more so as a leaning mechanism. Don't use it as the only rebuttal you have. Alright, be respectful, please. So, if your opponent is being a butthole, don't be one back. Again, your judge will probably see that you're being respectful, and if your opponent is being mean, it's only gonna benefit you. It might not benefit you, but it's not gonna hurt you for sure, right? So, in questioning. So usually AF starts off and says, as first speaker, may I have the first question? It's always a respectful thing to let AF ask the first question. It's just basic debater etiquette. I've never seen someone who has not followed that rule. In all of my years of debating and teaching and coaching and judging, never seen anyone not go by that rule. So let it not be you that decides not to follow that, right? So it should go, AF asks a question, neg asks a question, AF asks a question, neg asks a question. It's okay to ask a question, the person answers it, and say, may I have a follow-up? If they say no, that sucks, but people usually don't say no unless you ask for like 4 follow-ups. At that point, you're like, you've had 4 questions in a row, can I ask a question now? Right? So, again, feel it out by round. It's pretty straightforward, though. A lot of times, your opponent will talk over you and keep asking multiple questions. It's okay to cut them off, especially if you're a girl. And I don't want to make this about gender, but it's the hard truth as someone who's been debating for a very long time and has seen a lot of my female students debate. A lot of times, males will try and dominate and be very, very disrespectful towards you, especially if they go to a all-male school, which is mainly where I see this issue from. I remember one year, this was a year that I was partnering with my partner, Nana, and we went up against some guy, and in questioning, so she does first questioning and I do second questioning. In first questioning, she didn't get a single question out. He kept going over and going over and going over, and he's like scoffing and like, right? And all I wanted to do was say, Nana, stop, like, cut him off, right? It's okay. If they're being very attacking, you can be strict to the point without being very disrespectful and rude back. So second questioning came around. The guy tried the same thing with me. And I said multiple times, there were certain times where he was trying to take over a minute of the 3-minute questioning to just keep talking about his case, and I cut him off and said, I understand your point, can we move on? That's fine. He was trying to continue questioning while I'm answering, and I wasn't even going over the reasonable time to answer a question. Like, I was only answering it for like 5 or 6 seconds, and he tried to cut me off and ask another question. And I would stop and said something like, you need to let me finish answering. You can't keep asking question after I have only spent 5 seconds answering. Let me finish, please. Strict, you still say please, you still seem respectful. And it also kind of hints to the judge, this guy's kind of being a prick, right? Or if they keep asking a question and I'm answering and then again and again, then I say, it's my turn to ask a question now. Don't even say, can I ask a question? No, it's my turn to ask a question now. So you can be still respectful about it and still be cutthroat. You have to find that balance. If they're being blatantly disrespectful, tell the judge you don't appreciate the way they're talking to you. This has never happened to me. It never has been this bad. This is usually if they're making a racist, sexist, discriminatory comment. You can call them out mid-round and say, no, this is not okay. I'm not going to handle this disrespect. I'm sorry. Judge, can we do something about this? Because if it's seriously that bad, right? Hopefully this will never have to happen. It's never had to happen to me or one of my students, but be aware of that. If the judge is being very rude or discriminatory, again, it has to be to an extreme level. It can't just be they like rolled their eyes or right. You should walk out, contact your coach or a superior if you don't want to put up with it, obviously. Lastly, I'm going to talk about a 2-person debate. So the questioning part is still 1v1. Sometimes when I go up against a partner, they think they can both be asking questions. No. So the way it works is person 1 if you're in a two-person debate, person one does their construction speech, and then person one is the person who does the questioning segment after the construction speech. Person two does the rebuttal, and person two does the questioning segment after rebuttal. I don't know necessarily how you want to do it. Sometimes, especially if my opponent seemed new, they didn't really know what they were doing, I would let them just both ask questions. If it seems like blatant and they know what they're doing and they're trying to sneak around it, you can interrupt and say, sorry, but only person one is allowed to ask questions during this questioning segment. Person two, you'll have time during your questioning segment. It's up to you and what you're comfortable with at the end of the day. Anyways, that is it for today's lesson. I hope all of these made sense. If you guys have any other general questions, let me know in the comments. These are just the main questions I get and main ethics and judge adaptation skills I think you guys should have going into debate. I hope all of this was helpful. Thank you guys for watching.